Welcome. This is our third Culture of the Future session in partnership with Zer0 Books. I'm very happy to have Billy Cashmore, who is our guest today and who will close the series. So thank you, Billy, and thank you everyone for coming. Culture of the Future is an online forum. It's an initiative by CETAPS, and the idea behind it is to discuss culture and social issues in all its forms. This is in partnership with Zer0 Books, and Zer0 Utopia is a book series published by Zer0 Books, and I have all of the 4 Zer0 Utopia books right here. And today we are going to focus on Billy's book, We Hear Only Ourselves. Billy is a writer and a philosopher who is based in East London, and they work predominantly on Marxism, critical theory, and the Black radical tradition, and their next project is on the dialectics of value in Marx's critique of political economy. And Billy's new book, We Hear Only Ourselves, published by Zer0 Books, is available now, and there should be a link on the chat right now. So Billy, thanks again. Very happy to have you, and please go ahead.
Thank you, Manuel. It's a real pleasure. Thanks also to CETAPS for organising this. And although no one involved in the production of the book other than me is here, I feel like I should thank Zer0 for allowing me to write this book. It's kind of an unbelievable pleasure to write a book at such an early stage. It didn't really feel like it was going to happen, but it somehow did. I need to say quite a lot, so I'm going to just start talking. Okay. At the beginning of Book 2 of Utopia, Raphael begins to report to Thomas More and Peter Giles what he found on his travels, this island called Utopia. The island, you will recall, is, quote, crescent-shaped, like a new moon, end quote, and 200 miles apart at its widest point, where it tapers off towards each end, which do not quite meet each other, allowing boats to pass through. What concerns me today is also what on many occasions concerns Frederick Jameson. I quote the passage in question. Quote, Utopus, who conquered the country and gave it its name, also changed its geography. After winning the victory at his first assault, he had a channel cut 15 miles wide where the land joined the continent, and thus caused the sea to flow around the country. This great trench that surrounds the island of Utopia. This structural feature of Utopia is what Jameson calls closure, a feature that elsewhere I call external totality. For example, in Morris's News from Nowhere, the closure is secured by the revolution that is so far in the past that is not even remembered. Now, all utopias require such external totalization in order to claim really to be nowhere. In Fourier's theory of the 4 movements, the division between his utopia and our present world is so great that if it affects changes in nature itself, Seas of Lemonade. Utopia must always, in some sense or another, be an island. But of course, Raphael has sailed to Utopia and eventually returned. There must be some conditions which allow for the revolution in Morris's News of Nowhere, some brave revolutionaries and presumably incompetent previous rulers. The external totality in question must therefore always be a compromised totality. Herein lies the problem of utopia. Utopia must be part of actuality if it is to relate to it, even to bear critically upon it, but it must also fully escape actuality. Now, more on my concept of actuality later, which is by no means theoretically neutral. For now, however, this is my problem. In fact, if any of you have looked at We Hear Only Ourselves, I hope you will realize that the 3 aporias that structure the argument are really this same problem, appearing in developed modes. Central to my method in that book, which is always my method, is to represent and develop the contradictions in our actuality in sequentially related modes in a kind of negative dialectic, wherein the apparent solution of each problematic gives rise to the next, with no final speculative solution. Before I rehearse my imminent critique of the idea of utopia, I want to say a little about the place of this structural problematic within political philosophy, in a sense, the importance of the idea of utopia. Under the bourgeois separation between political and civil society, tracking the liberal understanding of the state and private property, the political is represented as constitutive of social relations through the law as its mediating element, and thus beyond the social. From the standpoint of the private individual, therefore, that is to say of society, the law is presented as necessary. We must obey it on pain of punishment. From the standpoint of the political citizen, however, the law is changeable, contingent. Political changes are thus a rupture in social actuality. Of course, we good historical materialists have read Marx's On the Jewish Question, and will remember that no such distinction can really be upheld. The political is, in fact, constitutive of the social, insofar as the latter's relation of private property could not be upheld without laws and police forces and so on to keep it in place. And the legitimacy of those laws is only secured by an ideological apparatus that maintains a certain relation to the state by civil society. Nevertheless, the concept of this alienation persists as a result of the persistence of private property. It cannot be overcome by a mere act of thought. What this means, importantly, is that political philosophy must always be concerned with the fact that to do anything other than justify actually existing social relations, it must assume this position of externality to civil society. But in criticizing society, it necessarily depends on it, a relation that is maintained to forms of argumentation, literature, institutions, like the hospital, that are nevertheless the object of critique. This, I take it, is the origin of the real problem of ideology for political thought. The very idea of this thought, political thought, is as of external to the actual order of things, but is nonetheless produced by this order. What I am getting at here is that there is something about the problem of utopia that I think is reflective of the broader problem of politics. How is it that we can think outside of the world as it is given to us? Insofar as this world presents itself as right, we are thus presented with the concept of a moral politics, the establishment of a set of social relations which allows for a right way of living. In doing so, we are provided with the ability to indict the order of things and profess that this world is, in fact, not right, and the right world would be elsewhere. The problem of utopia is thus the reflection of that of ideology. This problem is that to which the represented legitimacy of the established order gives rise. As such, the problem of utopia mirrors the problem of rupture that affects the concept of politics in itself. More specifically, the problem of utopia is the normative expression of the problem of politics. Okay, so I'd better now repeat the opening argument of We Here Only Ourselves. My investigation began with Jameson's argument in Archaeologies of the Future that there are two distinct traditions of utopian thought. One of these, the utopian program, the formulation of a better society in the future, the other, the utopian impulse toward a more vaguely defined better world located in the interstices of our present actuality. I argue that this distinction originates in the polysemic quality of the term utopia. I'm going to quote myself at length here, I'm afraid, because it's worth being precise. As Miguel Abençor notes, while we know that topia is drawn from topos, a place, so utopia is always a location, there is an ambiguity in our reading of the u. It might first refer to oi, good, so that utopia is oitopos, the good place. Alternatively, u might mean, and this is an Abençor quotation, the Greek adverb ou, which in front of a single word, utopos, forms a sort of unique negative, utopos, the non-place, end quote from Abençor. This latter sense relates closely to the utopian program, insofar as the adverbial nature of the negation ou secures the radical separation of this place from actuality, a complete negation of our actuality. So utopia, on this view, is to be imagined and later implemented. The former, oitopia, as the good place, corresponds to the utopian impulse, where the goodness of utopia means that our striving in actuality towards goodness is, in a sense, a striving towards this good place. This correspondence is not simple. You can't just straightforwardly read utopia onto program and oitopia onto impulse. Rather, the correspondence lies between the two oppositions of utopia and utopia and program and impulse. Each opposition relates something outside of actuality to something within actuality. So the individual terms in each opposition do not correspond to one another except in their parallel opposition. Okay, end quote from me. Jameson makes two mistakes in his argument. One is that he takes the relation between program and impulse to be basically ahistorical. It is not. The utopian program was displaced by post-Kantian philosophy, articulated primarily through Marx and Engels' critique of the abstract quality of these programs. This is why Ernst Bloch is so important, insofar as he identifies this utopian impulse within actuality rather than have it imposed apparently from the outside, hence the so-called concreteness of his utopia in the Hegelian sense. These two modes of utopian thought really appear at different points in philosophical and political history. So-called utopian programs are now firmly in the realm of science fiction, nowhere near politics. The second mistake that Jameson makes, and this is connected to his own oscillation between the two positions, beginning on the side of the impulse in his early essay on reification and mass culture, moving towards the program in archaeologies of the future, and then latterly again kind of to the impulse in the essay on Walmart in valences of the dialectic. My argument is structured around that initial observation that Jameson could not stick to one of these traditions. This is not just a case of catching him red-handed in a contradiction, but rather a claim that he cannot think the one tradition without the other because they cannot be so thought. The utopian program implies a utopian impulse, since in order to be connected to actuality, in order to be established, there must be some part of us which allows for its establishment. In Thomas More's utopia, which is represented as an archetypal, purely programmatic form, the impulse appears as the desire to fulfill our genuine pleasures, which are, quote, according to the behests of nature, end quote. So therefore, there is an appearance of a utopian impulse in Thomas More in his concept of genuine human happiness. Similarly, the utopian impulse implies a utopian program, since it is not strictly utopian without some idea of its topos. Indeed, the problem of the absolute question in Bloch's The Spirit of Utopia, the question of who we are, here standing as the paradigm of the utopian impulse, is only understood to be a problem in light of its possible solution, a proposed program. For Bloch, this was just the Bolshevik Revolution. But equally, the utopian program and an impulse are mutually occluding. Since the utopian program requires external totality, the Great Trench, it thus cannot be understood to arise out of actuality. Otherwise, it would not truly be utopia, not nowhere, but would rather be somewhere connected to us. In just the same fashion, the utopian impulse disallows the utopian program, since the latter would be construed as a merely abstract imposition on actuality, rather than concretely developing out of actually existing social relations. The tradition of the utopian impulse is thus committed to the view that we do not yet know what our utopia will be. So we can see that an aporia is created. We cannot have the program without the impulse, nor vice versa, and yet one seems to occlude the other. This is the speculative aporia of utopia, its problem, which I have argued is reflective of the problem of the political rupture of the social. Okay, second section, time and narrative. I now need to explain the connection I'm making between utopia and time. This move is crucial if my application of the concept of narrative is to be more than a merely arbitrary imposition, reducible to something like the claim that setting narratives is important for successful social movements. That's not at all what I'm saying. I do this here, and in We Here Only Ourselves, via the claim that that the aporia of utopia is structurally analogous with that of time as outlined in Paul Ricoeur's Time and Narrative, the 3 volumes. The argument there begins with St. Augustine's cry out for knowledge in Book 10 of the Confessions. Quote, "What then is time? I know well enough what it is, provided that nobody asks me, but if I am asked what it is and try to explain, I am baffled." End quote. Now, this strikes me initially as a problem of utterance. We cannot but speak as if we know what time is, but the moment it is called into question, the rug is pulled out from underneath us. In his initial question, Augustine outlines the aporia of the being and non-being of time. How can we speak of something which, as past, is no longer, as present is passing away, and as future is not yet? And yet, of course, we must always speak of it. Augustine's solution, which in a sense is a model of mine and Ricoeur's response, is to internalize this aporia in the threefold present, wherein the past is understood as memory and the future as expectation, since the past and the future are only because they are present. That is, the problem becomes one of how to bring this distended threefold quality of temporality under the aegis of the unifying present. What we have here is ultimately a problem of unification, given the rupture between past and future. Time must be both divided and unified in the present. This is what Ricoeur calls discordant concordance, another name for the aporia of rupture that I have so far outlined. Notice, however, that in answering this aporia of the being and non-being of time, we generate a spatialized discourse of temporality. Time is unified under or in the present. We are led then to Augustine's other aporia, that of the measurement of time. This measurement must be done in relation to some measurable period of time, right? And it seems that the present cannot be said to have any periodical quality, any duration, because any extension of the present would be an extension into the past or future, and it would be no longer present. Again, the solution is found in the distended soul across three modalities of action, namely memory, attention, and expectation, corresponding to the threefold modes of the present, past, present, future, respectively. Indeed, it is not time as such, but rather memory and expectation that we measure for Ricoeur. As famously argued in Augustine, when we begin to recite a poem, we initially hold all of it in our expectation. It's, you've got 12 lines to go. And as we direct our attention upon each word, it passes from expectation, which grows shorter, towards memory, which grows longer. But the issue remains, in what sense are we saying shorter or longer? What is it exactly that is increasing and diminishing? What impressions are given to the mind such that we are able to compare a long time with a short one? The apparent solution to the two aporias of psychological time, that of being and measurement, has not been able to respond simply with the distension of the mind and the threefold present. It still requires a time turned towards the time of the world, the objective, imperious succession of instants to which we are always subject. You can see that it's basically a problem of unification, which is another way of seeing a problem of rupture. This problem of measurement is what draws Ricoeur towards the Aristotelian, cosmological, as opposed to psychological account of time. But Aristotle equally faces an aporia of rupture, to be expected by this point. For Aristotle, and I quote myself again here, quote, "Our claims about time are based on noting 2 points within it, instants, within a continuous field of movement, and thus claiming that one occurs before the other, so 4 p.m. before 5 p.m. Thus, an instant is a break between a before and an after, and the present is just the instant identified as the now by a particular mind. But the present is not merely that which divides a before and an after, it is also what unifies them into a line of succession, such that they are to be called the past and future of this now, respectively. Therefore, the instant, as a radical separation in the movement of time, cannot account for the simultaneously continuous and discontinuous nature of the present. And so we are once again led to the idea of a discordant concordance, a phenomenological account of time. The only response to this problem of rupture for Ricoeur and for me is with narrative. This narrative response is what I will now recount. We begin with Aristotle's pair of concepts from the Poetics, mimesis, the representation of action, and muthos, the organization of events or implotment. However, from the beginning, these are quasi-identified, as Ricoeur says, by Aristotle, in his declaration that, quote, "the imitation of action is the plot." For Aristotle, each act of implotment, muthos, is a mimesis of human action, since to write a plot means precisely to configure events into an order in which actions appear in a particular order. So Theseus does this, and then it goes down into the labyrinth and so on. A plot, then, is an outcome of mimesis. This implotment is then taken by Ricoeur as a model of discordant concordance, the thing that we're looking for, since this mimetic activity, is, quote, "set up as the poetic solution to the speculative paradox of time, inasmuch as the inventing of order is pursued to the exclusion of every temporal characteristic," end quote. Simply, It is the most basic fact that a plot is the synthesis of the heterogeneous. Disparate elements, chapters, characters, words, sentences, even pages appear to come together into a single whole, a plot. If the problems of time, their respective aporias, were that it could not make a concordance of the discordant, neither in the distended soul nor of time divided into a succession of instants, poetics, what we might today call narratology, provides one such response. At this point, I need to explain how narrative actually holds together in its concept these discordant temporal elements. It seems to me that this is accomplished through its threefold character in time and narrative. So the term mimesis of action doubles the meaning of the term action, where it's both the action in the narrative mythos, the plot, but also the action of which that action is a mimesis, the real. As such, the first element of narrative composition is a prefiguration of the actual structure of human action, mimesis 1. The second configuration, or mimesis 2, is the creative act of composition of stories, implotment, or mythos. The third refers to the effect on the reader, since a narrative is only effective when represented to a reader or spectator or listener to whom the elements appear as elements of the whole plot and is so affected, mimesis 3, refiguration. Third section, modality and mimesis. So something that I too easily skated over in the book was the specific relation between narrative and actuality. There, I simply and somewhat happily just assert that I've transposed the problem of the relation between actuality and possible futures by introducing actuality at the level of prefiguration, narrative category, and possible futures at the level of refiguration. What I aim to do here, which is, while somewhat a detour, is really the whole point of the presentation, is to bring the question of mimesis directly to bear on the post-Kantian account of objectivity. Most of you will be overly familiar with Kant's so-called Copernican revolution, so I'm going to be quite brief on this matter. But the fundamental Kantian contribution to philosophy is the introduction of subjective conditions of possibility into the definition of what it means for something to be an object. This is accomplished most fully in the transcendental deduction in the first critique, though perhaps it is most evident in the analytical judgments that follows, that relocates apparently objective laws of nature in transsubjective conditions of the transcendental unity of apperception, the I. Some of you may notice that my reading here is influenced in no small part by Adorno, who summarizes beautifully that, quote, the Kantian project can actually be characterized not as one that adopts subjectivism in order to do away with the objectivity of cognition, but as one that grounds objectivity in the subject as an objective reality. Most importantly for my purposes here is the specific and highly problematic place of modal concepts, possibility, necessity, actuality, in Kant's analysis. There are really two sides to this. One, the structure of transcendental argumentation is to take a given representation and ask after its conditions of possibility. I take that's what critique means in the Kantian sense. Importantly, the argument is inseparable from the epistemologized ontology that Kant generates, since the ground of the existence of the transcendental I of apperception is in its being a condition of possibility for cognition. This means that rather than being mere categories of the understanding, these modal terms, more specifically possibility and necessity, appear at a supra-categorial level insofar as they are involved in grounding the transcendental unity of apperception, objectivity itself, or which is itself the ground of objectivity. One can see this, perhaps most starkly, in the appearance of these modal categories, which are meant to only come with the understanding, in the transcendental aesthetic, since space and time are read as pure forms of intuition, without which appearance would not be, and here's a key word, possible. Two, so this is the second and perhaps most important thing for me. It's less well known, what is less well known is the importance of the post-Kantian redefinition of actuality in terms of the act of the transcendental subject. Howard Kegel notes in his invaluable Kant dictionary that prior to Kant, the relation between possibility and actuality concerned the presence or absence of the predicate existence. A being is actual if it is possible and it exists. Furthermore, possibility is understood virtually exclusively through the law of non-contradiction. A possible being is one whose existence did not imply a logical contradiction. Kant's critical turn meant that dogmatic logical laws such as these could no longer serve as the ground of philosophizing. And so possibility and actuality needed to be re-understood in terms of their relation to the transcendental subject. Kant therefore redefines possible beings as those which agree with, quote, the formal conditions of experience, and actual ones as those connected with the material conditions of experience. These are the postulates of experience regarding the categories of actuality and possibility. But actuality equally operates supracategorically in acts of judgment which actualize concepts. These concepts could remain merely formal, not actually applying to anything, but they are applied to sensuality by submitting them according to their existence at a determinate time. Beings are only actualizable if they agree with the material conditions of experience outlined in the aesthetic, but they are only actualized by judgment. Herein lies the centrality of action to the post-Kantian philosophy of modality and of objectivity. Notice, however, that the necessity of the Kantian transcendental is only secured by the claim that only one act, namely the synthetic act, is possible. If today we accept the critique of the ahistoricity of the Kantian transcendental, insufficiently mediated for itself by social relations, then the point is that this is not, in fact, the only possible act. This transcendental subject in post-Kantian philosophy is, of course, contested. Its most famous 19th century variations, Hegel, Marx, Nietzsche. For all, however, action remains central insofar as the actualization of concepts is continually the outcome of whatever takes the place of Kant's transcendental apperception. So in Hegel, the development of spirit; in Marx, the development of the forces of production; in Nietzsche, conceptual transformations, of which the slave revolt is one. This is the key thing. This is why Rupture is able to plausibly assert that the third mode of mimesis, refiguration, is the refiguration of human experience, precisely because of the direct connection between action and these various modal categories, which are so central to the post-Kantian account of experience. Mimesis, qua mimesis of action, that is to say, narrative, is related to objectivity insofar as the actuality of beings is mediated by their relation to action in the manner outlined above. This locates the creation of new possible objects, not in mimesis 2, configuration, in the mere declaration of that certain objects are possible, utopian programs or fictions, for example, but rather in their refiguration of a human experience through this implotment. Narrative is thus doubly related to actuality, both as prefigured by an existing set of meanings, but also insofar as its refigurative capacity can extend the sphere of possible objects. This is the futural character of narrative, the creation of something new. All I hope to have done there is just to further explicate the relation between my account of narrative and the modal considerations required by any serious discussion of the problem of utopia, that of rupture. So I have a conclusion here, which is called utopia. With this, we are prepared for the final narrative response to the utopian problem of rupture outlined at the beginning of this paper. The concept of utopia is now split along the threefold mimesis of narrative. Prefiguration. We can understand this broadly as the scope of meanings presently actual, or in another description, as history made effective through its transmitting of meaning into the present. For one, we can include all previous utopian programs at this point, and furthermore, the histories of less strictly utopian struggles, say the Haitian Revolution, that we might nonetheless align with utopian ends. In the book, I align this with Walter Benjamin's account of the tradition of the oppressed. I have no time, of course, to elaborate that here. I must note that this prefiguration, however, nonetheless includes, of course, the non-utopian, everything that we want to escape. Though it must be said that just as a work of philosophy is to a greater extent prefigured by the history of philosophy than would be, say, a novel or an episode or a sitcom, so a work of utopian thought must be thought to be prefigured more greatly by the history of utopianism than by any other field of meaning. 2. Configuration. This is the moment of the construction of utopian narratives. I'd wanted to make some final remarks regarding two particular modes of utopian narrative, in this case concerning firstly blackness and secondly trans identity. I talk about the former a lot in We Here Only Ourselves, and I've spoken elsewhere about trans identity. I'd be very happy to take questions on this. The configuration of utopian narratives is not, therefore, the place of the program, but closer in many respects to a history. More specifically, I read this together with Adorno's account of the artwork in aesthetic theory, which is adopted in many respects by Fred Moten's account of black performance in The Break. Utopian narrative always involves the mimesis of an impossible action, which here would be a rupture with the actual. It is at this point in the construction of narratives that the modal category of impossibility appears. It is here that we articulate and demand the impossible. Finally, refiguration. In this, we have the refigurative force of utopian narrative. This is where I locate the relevance of my rather long detour regarding modality. Since utopian narrative fails to break with the actual by virtue of the pull of its prefigurative mode on the configurative, its refigurative force is to criticize this actuality, and in so doing, articulates the possibility of the new, an action against this actuality, resistance. This is now the refound place of the utopian impulse, primarily in a resistant energy against the actual. Utopian narrative is a transformation function against actuality that works through continuity and rupture in order to create new possible objects, new possible actions. So impulse and program remain in their own places within this mimesis. They're structurally antagonistic, as they ought to be, via their appearance at different moments in prefiguration and refiguration, brought into discord and concordance by their configuration in a plot. Importantly, furthermore, the passing of time means that the refigured experience provided by narratives eventually becomes part of actuality and thus enter at the first level. So these utopian narratives are historically developmental, they're not ahistorical. This is how utopian narrative responds to the aporia originating in the question of rupture, through the internalization of this aporia into its narrative concept, the dynamic interplay of prefiguration and refiguration. As a concluding remark, note that the role of utopia on my account has little to do with the content of these utopias. Their character is a formal effect of this structural interplay between the actual and the possible in the configuration of actual impossibilities. The content as such makes no difference. I hope that one outcome of my work on this might be a slight decrease in the number of merely scholastic considerations of various alternatives to our present moment. Various queer or trans utopias, degrowth futures, eco-feminist utopias, imagine them all you want, but their formal character, their relation to the idea of utopia itself, is all that matters. It is only this that will impel us toward a better world. Thank you.
I was wondering what drew you to make these connections between critical theory, utopia, and Black studies, which you do in your book, and trans identity, which you are doing now and elsewhere. So what drew you to that, and could you expand on your ideas?
The simple answer as to why I was drawn to connect the two, in the case of trans identity, is because I'm trans. So I wanted to write about it, and I hadn't written about it, and I spent all this time thinking about it, and I hadn't said anything, and I had this tool, this way of thinking about utopia, and I wanted to. And I suppose, you know, the point of the first part of this talk was to talk about what I believe to be kind of the general status of the problem of utopia and what I thought it does philosophically and its relevance. And so I think that it should be unsurprising that something which understands itself as to some extent liberatory, trans identity and trans theory, would want to have something to say about utopia. And I think if you read Butler, right, the whole problem in Gender Trouble and Bodies That Matter is the extent to which we are implicated in that which we resist. This is the problem of utopia. And then in the case of Black studies, I wasn't drawn to Black studies from utopia. I was drawn to utopia from Black studies. So I read Fred Moten basically because I just heard of it. And I read the introduction to In the Break, which is probably just about my favorite piece of philosophical writing. And felt that it answered that post-Butlerian problematic that I mentioned there, and explicitly does, in a way that I thought was particularly interesting. And then I just, and I felt that Fred Moten, independent of his writings on race or on blackness as such, or rather, his writings on blackness are inseparable from his on para-ontology. But insofar as his philosophy has kind of a general scope rather than specifically black studies as a particular discipline, although status of that discipline is complicated in Moten. I felt he had something to say in terms of utopia, and the more I dug, the more that I found that there was this problem of utopia. Mostly, I think, probably coming from his friendship with Munoz, who's thanked in the break. So, and also kind of conversations which I think Moten has had with Lee Edelman and people like that. So, but yes, I was led to utopia from black studies, not vice versa.
You write, Billy, in your foreword, that, and I quote, if philosophy is to serve any radical political purpose whatsoever, the initial experience of reading it must be in comprehension. And I wonder if philosophy should serve politics, or if philosophy is already political. And this, I would ask the same regarding utopia. So what do you think?
The political place of philosophy is as of serving the political. So its politicality, its political concept is its serving of political. So they're actually the same thing. So if you think that a good example of a philosophy which understands itself as to do with organizing the polis, you're probably going to read like the Republic. That would be the first example, whose description of the good life, which would seem to be the realm of kind of ethics philosophy, is always right. There's always like the democracy and the democratic man, right? They're always mirrored. And so the question of whether philosophy understands itself outside of politics, well, yes, it does. It just isn't. That's ideology. So the problem of ideology, as I've outlined in this talk, is precisely the fact that philosophy considers itself outside of the political, but is always indexed in fact to it. But the kind of rigidly Adornian answer, which I'm liable to reproduce here, is to say that that is a bourgeois understanding of the relation between civil society and the state that is subject to those various criticisms of the relationship between civil society and the state that you get in Marx. But that isn't to say that therefore we've just got to say that we're all really serving the state. You've just got to understand that relation dialectically, indeed negative dialectically, and see that you're given these terms like rightness, which are nonetheless given to you by society, but there's a kind of futurity into them in that by simply placing a negation in front of them, you're able to criticize the actual. It presents itself as right, and you then get the concept of right, and it's up to you then to decide that you don't think the world is right. I feel that that's perhaps an answer. So this sort of the answer to the question, is utopia or philosophy political, or does it merely serve the political? The answer is yes. Both.
Thanks, Billy. So I think that's all the time that we have today. Can you just tease very quickly your next project?
It's sort of an attempt to go from utopia to science, right? And so I became concerned that my account of actuality in a narrative sense was kind of unable to account for anything like a crisis in our actuality. So a contradiction to something in our actuality that perhaps was driving us out of it, right? Which I think, and I felt that sometimes I ended up being a bit too abstract. The stuff on value is, but sort of they both begin from the same place, which is that opening to In the Break. So Moten claimed that he's got a new theory of value, and it's the most explicit thing. And so I'm talking about that, and I'm talking about winter quite a lot. But it's all about this idea of a resistance on the basis of narrative, and a lot of what I'm talking about is via the relationship between value and narrative. If you haven't read Nomos and Narrative by Robert Cover, it's a particularly good investigation of the relationship between law, value, and narrative by an American legal scholar in the 80s, I think. It's really good.
That officially brings us to a close then. Thank you, Billy. It was just great having you, and John and everyone else. So as I've showed in the beginning, so these are the 4 Zer0 Utopia books. And
And my rent is expensive.
yeah, exactly. Thanks again so much, Billy, for your talk. Billy Cashmore's "We Hear Only Ourselves" is available now from Zer0 Books. Thank you all, and see you next time.